So first, I'd like to thank Asia Society, and in particular, Deborah Klimberg-Salter and Adriana Proser for organizing this symposium, and to say again, congratulations for a lovely Tucci exhibition. My topic today draws on a project that I am developing for an exhibition opening at the Rubin Museum next February, Faith and Empire, Art and Politics in Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, so here comes my pitch. Okay, next slide, please. Tibetan Buddhism's dynamic political role was a major catalyst, moving it beyond Tibet's borders east to its neighbors, the Tanguts, the Mongols, the Chinese, and the Manchus. However, Tucci never made it this far to its eastern borders. Tibetan Buddhism was especially attractive to conquest dynasties, as it offered both a legitimizing model of universal sacral kingship that transcended ethnic and clan divisions, which could unite a disparate people, and also promised esoteric means to physical power, right? That is, ritual magic, which could be harnessed to expand empires. By the 12th century, Tibetan masters became renowned across northern Asia as bestowers of this anointed rule and occult power. The use of reincarnation in particular as a means of succession was a unique Tibetan form of political legitimacy employed by courts in Tibet and brought to the empires to their east. Images were one of the primary means of political propagation, integral to magic, tantric rites, and embodiments of its power. Oh, actually, I went one too far, sorry. While Buddhist involvement in politics might seem an anathema, this stems from Western perceptions of the tradition, which are largely romanticized projections born from its colonial encounters. The notion that this is a faith is a religion of nonviolence is a popular misconception, resulting from a separation from this history. In politics, this faith was a path to legitimation and a means to power, its ritual a potential weapon of war, and art its conduit. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's message of nonviolence is inspirational around the world, but this has not historically been the emphasis, but rather born out of the 20th century, inspired by Gandhian ideals. To project this into the past is both ahistorical and misleading, although projecting the interests of the present back into the past is as old as history itself. My objective here is to reground Tibetan Buddhist art in its historical context and highlight a dynamic aspect of the tradition which may run counter to popular perception, yet is critical in understanding its importance on the world stage. Buddhism has been engaged as a political force from very early on across Asia, and, as we just heard in numerous talks, in Tibet, religious and Tibet political authority became so intertwined as to become inseparable. It is in the 7th to 9th centuries that the Tibetans first dramatically step onto the world stage in the form of the Tibetan Empire, which became one of the great military powers of Asia and Tang Dynasty China's greatest military rival. The earliest surviving Sino-Tibetan artistic exchange also dates to the 8th to 9th centuries, when the Tibetan Empire ruled over large Chinese subject populations in the Heshi area of Gansu, including Dunhuang, here marked by this red diamond, an important center of Buddhist activity in the Gobi Desert at the eastern end of the Silk Route. During this period, one sees the appearance of Tibetan figures alongside Chinese in paintings found at Dunhuang, such as this dramatic illustration from a local Chinese family cave dated 839, where the political relationship between China and Tibet is laid bare. The Chinese emperor has lost his sword and is down to 3 tassels of rank on his cap, while the Tibetan camp is armed to the teeth. So I don't know if you can see all the swords here. And actually the Tibetan emperor is raised on a dais as well. This painting dates to shortly after this region was ceded to the Tang by the Tang to the Tibetan Empire in 822. Thus, this religious painting, commissioned by one of the local leading Chinese families at Dunhuang, makes clear statement about the political reality on the ground. Whoops. Okay. Tibetan state patronage at Dunhuang has been suggested at Anshi Yulin Cave 25, which appears to be closely related to the Tridict Edi temple described in 9th century Tibetan documents found at Dunhuang, dedicated by the local Tibetan military government on occasion of the signing of the Sino-Tibetan Peace Treaty of 822. While the style of the paintings are a combination of Chinese, on the right, and a new aesthetic introduced under Tibetan rule, there is a clear unifying theme, that of the Chakravartin ruler. The Chakravartin, or universal wheel-turning king, was a concept of sacral rule in India that was imported into Central and East Asia with Buddhism, whereby conquest by a devout king was seen to spread Buddhism and thus give the ruler divine sanction to expand his empire. The theme of sacrosanct rulership is actually stated in the treaty temple's dedication, which is equated with building a divine palace, where the merit generated is dedicated to the Tibetan emperor, and I quote, so that he can become a Chakravartin ruler, exercising authority over the 4 continents and other kingdoms as well. Later, the first Tibetan emperor was considered an emanation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, indicating that his was a divine rule. And note the little Buddha head peeking out of his turban. So this will become an important political symbol with the later unification of Tibet under the Dalai Lamas in the 17th century. After the Tibetan Empire collapsed, there was a period of political fragmentation and chaos in central Tibet, and the lack of centralized political or religious authority gave rise to local tantric masters establishing their own authority. As institutional Buddhism began to regain its footing in the 11th and 12th centuries, the image of the Tibetan emperor as bodhisattva transformed into a potent religio-political symbol. The first to effectively appropriate this symbol of legitimacy by declaring himself a reincarnation of the Tibetan emperor was Lama Shang. Directly involving himself in political and military affairs, Lama Shang is himself a fascinating study in the political and martial employment of Vajrayana Buddhism during the late 12th century. Lama Shang ruled territory, conflated religious action with royal prerogative, and even fielded his own students in battle as part of their religious practice. Thank goodness we didn't have to do that in graduate school. Equipped not only with conventional weapons, such as bows and spears, Lama Shang also employed a ritualized warfare of magic spells, aided by the summoning of powerful protector deities, such as Sri Devi and Mahakala. Interestingly, Lama Shang's own small Kagyu monastic suborder had direct ties to the Tangut court, the next political polity to rise to prominence. For instance, the Tangut imperial preceptor Tushirepa, while ethnically a Tangut, trained with Lama Shang. It was under Lama Shang's tutelage that the foundations were laid for the future Tangut imperial preceptor's involvement with the cult of the protector deity Mahakala as a means to worldly empowerment. The Tangut kingdom of Shisha, a small but powerful multi-ethnic empire along the Silk Route, first established many of the imperial practices of Tibetan Buddhism and art at court, later emulated by larger regimes, such as the Mongol Empire. Tibetan and Chinese religious and artistic traditions were integrated through Tangut patronage, creating a new visual model of sacral rule. Buddhism served the state in legitimation and engendered lavish imperial patronage, the Tangut emperors presenting themselves as universal sacral Chakravartin rulers. Among the northern nomads, the Tangut emperors were known as the Buddha Khan. The Tanguts employed a self-conscious, multicultural strategy, editing texts in 3 languages at once, Tangut, Chinese, and Tibetan. In their art, one also sees a mixing of both the Chinese and Tibetan iconographic as well as stylistic traditions to meet the Tangut patrons' particular needs. One hallmark of the Tangut court was lavish silk images, such as embroidered cut silk, or kusa, which you see here, a complex luxury silk medium developed in Central Asia and adopted by the Tangut court for the making of Tibetan Buddhist icons. And here's a detail that shows you that tiny seed pearls are actually woven directly into the fabric. The printed icon of a wrathful deity excavated from the Tangut site of Karakoto bears invocations which make its political role clear. At top, Om, fierce great Lord, please protect. And allow me to pronounce things properly. Long life to the emperor. And at left, peace to the people, grandeur to the state. The wrathful deity, Mahakala in particular, became a special focus of Tangut imperial Buddhism. Mahakala is a powerful Buddhist protector deity, a manifestation of divine wrath used in removing obstacles, and historically considered especially effective in military applications. For instance, one Tibetan Buddhist cleric who is tied to the Tangut imperial line, Tamilo Tsawa, is linked to at least 16 texts on this wrathful deity, Mahakala, including one called The Instructions of Sri Mahakala, The Usurpation of Government, a short how-to work on overthrowing a state and taking power. Right, so not too subtle. When Chinggis Khan first laid siege to the Tangut capital in 1207, the Tangut's Tibetan court preceptor summoned Mahakala to the battlefield, at which point the dams the Mongols were using to flood the city burst, drowning Mongol troops and forcing Chinggis to withdraw. This account of their unusual military setback through effective religious ritual no doubt caught Mongol attention. And the Mongol Empire refuses to be revealed. Basically, imagine, if you will, basically showing the Mongol Empire at 1260 when Kublai Khan comes to power, basically from the gates of Vienna, right, all the way down through Asia. The Mongols established the largest contiguous empire in world history, from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Vienna. The Mongols conquered most of Asia in the 13th century, thereby bringing Tibetan visual culture to the Chinese heartland. While Kublai Khan established a government on a Chinese system, rather than depending on the Chinese literati, they relied heavily on peoples from other areas of his empire, such as the Uyghurs, the Tanguts, and Tibetans. While the Mongol Empire was known for a policy of religious tolerance among peoples they conquered, and for generous patron across a broad spectrum of religions, Kublai Khan singled out Tibetan Buddhism among the faiths competing for court attention. In 1260, Kublai declared himself Great Khan, leading to civil war and fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, Kublai remaining in control of Asia. His Tibetan preceptor Pagpa initiated Kublai Khan into Tibetan Buddhist rites. And in turn, Kublai, as part of his offerings, granted Pagpa suzerainty of Tibet in the name of the Mongol Empire, which is depicted there on your left. Later, when Kublai Khan declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, he made Pagpa imperial preceptor, the highest religious authority in the land, depicted here on the right. Lovely portrait. Note Kublai Khan and his wife Chabi, herself known for her devotion to Tibetan Buddhism, and Pagpa in particular, depicted smaller on Pagpa's left, hands clasped in reverence. Until the fall of the dynasty, it became Yuan practice to appoint Tibetans as imperial preceptors. This relationship between the Mongol imperial emperor Kublai and his Tibetan chaplain Pagpa, often characterized as a priest-patron relationship, became a model that would be invoked by subsequent imperial courts and Tibetans for centuries to come. The wrathful figure of Mahakala in particular became state protector and focus of the imperial cult. And a sculpture of this deity made for Kublai Khan's final assault on the remains of the Chinese Empire, the Southern Song, became a potent symbol of both Kublai's rule and the Yuan imperial lineage. Mahakala was credited with intervening in several key battles, and many temples dedicated to Mahakala were built throughout the empire. In the most famous example, in 1275, Kublai asked his Tibetan preceptor for the protector deity to intervene against the Southern Song, which his greatest general could not conquer. Mahakala was cited going house to house on the battlefield, sending Chinese troops fleeing. When the Chinese petitioned their god of war, Zhenwu, to deliver them from the Mongol onslaught, he left a note on his altar saying that he, too, had to yield to the black god leading the Mongol army. And within a short time, the Chinese surrendered. You can sort of imagine the Looney Tunes, right, with the legs, moving in place. That's all, folks. So this association was so strong that even 4 centuries later, when the Manchus, lacking the proper bloodlines, traced their own spiritual ancestry to Kublai Khan, as the rightful inheritors of his Yuan legacy, installed this same statue of Mahakala in their own imperial shrine in 1635. And the location of this sculpture disappeared with the fall of the Qing. This is a closely dated stand-in, but if anyone knows where that sculpture is, please see me after the talk. Even after the collapse of the Mongol Yuan and the Chinese reclaimed their land, establishing the native Ming dynasty, the Chinese court continued to follow Mongol precedents for imperial Buddhist vocabulary symbolic of divine rule. By this time, Kublai Khan's model of rulership was recognized across Asia. Thus, the early Ming rulers were speaking in the accepted language of power in declaring their authority. The Yongle Emperor was the first Ming emperor to establish significant ties with Tibetan patriarchs, and recently there has been some acceptance that he was probably a believer in Tibetan Buddhism. The most significant event in Sino-Tibetan relations during the early Ming was the visit of the fifth Karmapa, Deshin Shekpa, to the early Ming capital of Nanjing in 1407. In dealing with the Karmapa, Yongle consciously drew parallels in his own actions to Kublai Khan's relationship with his Tibetan imperial preceptor Pagpa during the founding of the previous Yuan dynasty. According to Tibetan sources, Yongle expressed an interest in recreating their priest-patron relationship. The Karmapas were of particular interest to Yongle, as they were the last preceptors of the Yuan and were viewed as anointers of sacral kingship par excellence. Indeed, after the Karmapa's visit, Yongle styled himself a Chakravartin ruler. And here we see this relationship codified, where Yongle is receiving consecration as a sacral ruler. And you can see his face reflected in the mirror as part of the ablution rites. So we were talking about the role of mirrors and consecration in Harvard last weekend. So here you can actually see it in action. While discussions of Ming court interest in Tibetan Buddhism tends to be limited to the Yongle emperor alone, he was by no means the most extreme among Ming emperors in his adoration of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan art continued to receive significant court patronage, but Emperor Wuzong was an enthusiastic patron of Tibetan Buddhism who took a zeal to a level few had dared. According to his unofficial biography, and I quote, "The emperor studied Tibetan scripture, converted to this religion, dressed in Tibetan monk's robes, and practiced Dharma at court." According to Tibetan sources, Wuzong adopted the Tibetan name Rinchen Pelden and even went so far as to style himself an emanation of the seventh Karmapa. Right? So he thought he was one of the big incarnate lamas. Far from wishful thinking on the part of Tibetans, this assertion and the mission of the eunuch envoy who carried these tidings was received rather coldly by the Karmapa's court. Right? So they thought he was a bit of a nutter. The Tibetan name Rinchen Pelden on such tankas as this is thus none other than the emperor himself, and the occasion of its creation is the emperor's birthday. As we can see, demand for Tibetan objects within the Ming court was strong and the cause of their creation multivariate. The system of succession through reincarnation became an important means of political legitimacy in Tibet, no better exemplified than by the Dalai Lamas, who came to power by Mongol military force in 1642, becoming the first theocratic rulers of a unified Tibet, which had been largely fractured since the collapse of the Tibetan Empire in the 9th century. As part of his claim to power, the fifth Dalai Lama promoted himself as an emanation of Avalokiteshvara, and thus conflated himself with the first Tibetan emperor, positioning the Dalai Lamas as the rightful inheritors of the Tibetan Empire. The Dalai Lamas and their regents widely publicized this connection through text and image, and this became one of the theological underpinnings of the government that ruled Tibet until 1959. By identifying himself as an incarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the Dalai Lama was employing a language of divine inheritance, the succession of past glorious empires through the religious mechanism of reincarnation. To reinforce this association, the Dalai Lama built his own massive seat of power on the same hill overlooking Lhasa, Marpuri, where once stood the palace of the Tibetan emperors of old, and named it Potala, after the earthly abode of Avalokiteshvara, Mount Potalaka. Another visual means through which the fifth Dalai Lama and his government promoted this connection was images of his pre-incarnations in both large-scale murals at his palace as well as in series of tanka paintings. One such series includes painting of Dzongtsen Gampo, right, the first Tibetan emperor, framed by the hand and footprints of the fifth Dalai Lama himself, which makes a direct visual statement about their conflated identities, and by extension, the Dalai Lama's political authority. An even more efficient means of spreading this message more widely was through the visual medium of woodblock prints. And what is especially interesting about this set, according to the catalog, these pieces are up in the Tucci show, is it appears that they were printed in color, right? So not just the image, but the color as well, which is a technology otherwise unknown in Tibet in the 17th century. And this may relate to the fifth Dalai Lama's trip to the Qing court in China, but This is, of course, speculation. This unique form of Tibetan theological statecraft through rebirth was also employed by the next emperors who ruled China, the Manchus. The Manchus, like the Mongols, were a nomadic people from the north of the Great Wall who conquered China and assumed Tibetan Buddhism as a means of political legitimacy in ruling a vast multi-ethnic empire. During their Qing dynasty, Tibetan Buddhism was once again an official religion of the empire. Under the Manchus, the visual language of Buddhist imperial rule was further refined, and the concept of sacral legitimacy given a finer point, with a special focus on the cult of Manjushri. The Manchu emperors, lacking the proper bloodlines to the Mongol ruling house, traced their own spiritual ancestry to Kublai Khan through the Tibetan succession mechanism of reincarnation. By promoting themselves as emanations of the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri, they declared themselves Kublai Khan reborn and the rightful inheritors of his Yuan legacy. This Manchu inheritance of Kublai's realm was propagated through the production of religious art. This was but one of several mutually reinforcing strategies aimed at various subjects and neighboring peoples in establishing and solidifying the Manchu's multi-ethnic empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Manchu rulers adopted certain personas to turn themselves into representatives of those respective cultures, whether Chinese or Mongol, Confucian or Buddhist, legitimizing their position and appropriating those cultural traditions by denying their image as outsiders who gained possession of them through force. Right? Cultural appropriation, it's a big topic right now. Part of this appropriation where entire temples in Tibet, such as the Potala Palace, were reconstructed in the Manchu summer capital at Chengde, northwest of Beijing. While Kangxi referred to himself as Manjushri in some Mongolian translations, it was really the Qianlong Emperor, more than any other Manchu ruler, who realized the potential of patronizing Tibetan Buddhism, as is evidenced by the incredible volume of Tibetan Buddhist images produced by the imperial workshops. Some of the most politically pointed images included many paintings depicting the Qianlong Emperor as an emanation of Manjushri, and by extension, Kublai Khan. They bear traditional Tibetan iconographic characteristics of book and sword at his shoulders, which visually identify him as Manjushri, as well as Tibetan inscriptions down here, which unequivocally declare him, and I quote, the sagacious Manjushri, the great being who manifests as lords of men. King of the Buddhist law, may be he steadfast on the Vajra throne. While Qianlong's unmistakable visage was realistically painted by the Italian Jesuit court painter Giuseppe Castiglione, in his lap, Qianlong holds the golden wheel of the universal sacral ruler. Above him, his Tibetan Buddhist preceptor, Jangye Ropé Dorje, his root lama. The Qianlong Emperor's court chaplain, Jangye Ropé Dorje, had a guiding hand in the formation of the Sino-Tibetan imperial Buddhist art of the Qing dynasty, which would come to symbolize Manchu rulership. From childhood, Ropé Dorje was educated with the imperial princes, and together they studied Buddhist scripture, as well as Chinese, Mongolian, Manchu, and Tibetan. This kind of close contact between monk and emperor from such an early age was unprecedented. Ropé Dorje's incarnation lineage was the only one manufactured by the Manchus and was carefully crafted to reflect that the priest-patron relationship between Kublai and Pagpa was reborn quite literally in Qianlong and himself. In 1745, Ropé Dorje initiated Qianlong into the rights of a divinely anointed sovereign, much as Pagpa did for Kublai. Later, when Ropé Dorje translated Pagpa's biography into Mongolian in 1753, he drew a direct parallel between these two acts, ruminating that he and the emperor had been connected through many lifetimes, and states directly that Kublai was the predecessor of Qianlong in the Manjushri incarnation lineage. That the British diplomat Lord Macartney, who was told by a Tartar Mongol official during his 1793 embassy that the Qianlong Emperor was an incarnation of Kublai Khan, also suggests that this association was well known. This is not to suggest that the Mongolian, Chinese, or Manchu empires were ruled as idealized Buddhist kingdoms, but the employment of religious rhetoric was part of their claim to legitimacy, and their deployment of religious ritual was one of the means by which they sought to take power and hold it. This is also not to say that this was some kind of a cynical manipulation of religion either. To limit motivations in the patronage of Tibetan Buddhism and its art to politics alone is to limit our own view, for religious faith and political acumen are not mutually exclusive, and it would be a mistake to project the cynicism of our age into the past. Looking to politics of today as a lesson, if someone were to use religion for political advantage, I don't know, George W. Bush says, God told me to run for president. This does not preclude the possibility that this person has faith. Indeed, this religio-political system depends on a belief in reincarnation and the efficacy of ritual magic. Thus, the modern Sino-Tibetan political situation is no longer governed by this system as in an entirely different chapter in history. Oh well, this slide was not revealed. Okay. Maybe someone can reveal that slide 36 while I talk. Though, the recent suggestion by a Chinese official that Xi Jinping is considered a living Buddhist deity consciously draws on this past. Thank you. Best laid plans.
You don't happen to have that last slide, do you, that he wanted revealed? Ah, there we go.
Waka, waka, waka.
Delayed punchline. Thank you for the wonderful talk and the humor. Are there any questions for Karl? Would you really like it back on? Yeah. Could we bring Pooh back, please?
Thanks, Karl. We ready?
I think we have a question down here.
Yeah. Thanks, Karl. It seems like we tend to talk about the Qianlong Emperor's alterations of style and potentially even iconography within the imperial palace workshops of sculptures and so forth, and reviving older styles and so forth. We tend to frame that discussion as a purely artistic enterprise that is in line with deeply ingrained practices of connoisseurship by the emperors. But could it, because he is an emanation of Manjushri and thus wields a certain amount of religious authority at the same time, is it possible, could we see the practices as an expression of religious or spiritual authority as well, and not purely just aesthetic and artistic?
Oh yeah, and I think that, the reproduction of entire Buddhist monasteries filled with dry lacquer sculpture and, the kind of the overwhelming force of opulence involved in that is, I think, is part of kind of an imperial program of declaring, both a religious and political authority. So I think, as we've said repeatedly, it's really hard to pull these things apart in this system. But Qianlong was all things to all subjects, right? So you would see him depicting himself as a Confucian scholar. I think there's even a great painting of him depicted as Vimalakirti debating Manjushri, of whom he is an emanation. So, Qianlong had no bounds. And I think that this is really, part of this strategy of dealing with, this, this large multi-ethnic conquest dynasty, where they really made an effort to project themselves as being part of those cultures as opposed to in opposition to those cultures.
I wanted to thank you very much for this lecture. I really learned a lot, and especially finding out that there is a violence in Buddhism also, because I know myself, and most people I know, were shocked at what has happened to the Rouhani people, because we all believe that the Buddhism was a peaceful religion. So thank you very much.
I like the fact that you touched upon the Dalai Lama tradition, and the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, has remarked a number of times that he's foreseeing an end to the Dalai Lama tradition after he leaves the body. I don't know how much he'd pursue that, but I know that all these years it's been under pressure from the younger generation Tibetans, to be more assertive. And of course, the younger generation Tibetans, the more radical among them, if I may say so, have been expressing themselves in rather near violent ways. So I would presume that the Dalai Lama understands very well this whole tradition, and I was wondering what would make him say that he's foreseeing an end to the Dalai Lama lineage.
Well, yes, let me speak for the emanation of Avalokiteshvara. I will not. But I think what's very interesting to this question is, would the Tibetans accept it? Or of course, the Chinese government's not going to accept it, but would the Tibetans accept it either? And I don't think this is the first time that this kind of thing has been sort of threatened. I'm it. This is it. So I really wonder, even if he did say that in the end, whether there wouldn't be a search for another one anyway. I think that it would be really tough. I'm not going to speak for the Dalai Lama or for Tibetans, but I think it's an interesting question. That what's behind that, but also, is that really the way it would go, even if he said it? And yeah, I'm doubtful.